Gabe,
Morning, Jay.
morning, sir. Another day in a row.
They keep coming.
I enjoyed our walk talk yesterday. It got me thinking a lot about the mathematics and the points and all that kind of abstract stuff, but also had me think about the idea that those mental excursions are incredible and inspirational and wonderful. And yet the ultimate goal of thinking clearly, thinking straight, thinking sanely is to be productive and be useful and be whole in terms of our action. And sometimes I think the two of them can get muddled, especially in this discussion where we're starting to talk about the disease rather than the symptom. And I know the disease is central to the big book and talking about the disease centers in the mind, but what is it that's centered in the mind that's causing the issues that remain after the recovery from the symptom? It's really the question that I asked for a long time and wondered about and began to see was the same between all the different 12-step programs when I did Herb Gay's workshop, and he invited everybody, all kinds of persuasion. And I could hear in all the discussion that the same central issue kept coming up, this sort of internal struggle, depression, anxiety, stress, etc., but wasn't even often talked about that way, just talked about almost as though it was a presumed state of a presumed condition that we just have to live with, that it's just a natural state and there's nothing we could do about it. We're better because we're not using, we're not drinking, we're not drugging, we're not overeating, we're not having promiscuous sex or dangerous sex, we're not doing any of the compulsions, or we have recovered from them and still seem to suffer this thing. And my sense was that that was not the point of the big book. And so, I investigated and looked and continued to today. So what's practical? What's simple in terms of expression?
Yeah, that would be interesting to be in those groups or sessions with all persuasions.
It was fascinating. I mean, it really lit I knew I was 18 years sober and I kept saying something's going on we're not talking about. Something's going on. And when I sat there, immediately had a sensation of, oh, the disease is alive and well. It's still occurring. The book talks about recovery from the symptom doesn't mean we're cured of the illness, because the potential to continue to do what we did to lead us to the impression that all we could do was the worst thing we could do. And not even the last thing we could do, but the thing we should do, but the thing we should never do as the only thing we could do. That same thinking is still brewing if it isn't addressed honestly and accurately. And so I did a little research since yesterday too. And, Freud created the modern version of ego, right? This discussion we have about ego. And the essence, the irony too, is he died 5 months after the book was published. So Bill's talking about ego in the book, but the concept had just barely been developed.
Oh, is that true? I never noticed that correlation.
Yeah. So he's talking about self-centeredness and all of these things as things we need to smash, completely abandon, and let go of, absolutely. And yet it seems an impossibility to actually do that, or it can seem an impossibility to do that. Seems to be the struggle of life. And what's interesting about the word ego is that it actually tracks back to the Latin and Greek as I, capital I. But what do we use it as the small I, the self that seems to be impish, mischievous, out of control, flagrantly some part of us that we can't seem to get under control. So we're constantly focused on how we can quash that internal struggle and quiet that thing when it doesn't even have a voice.
Yeah, we sure try hard. It's some other animal, some other puppet.
Well, it's like ID theft, effectively, like a fraud. an imposter. And an imposter syndrome, I would say, would be a very good definition of making believe that our thoughts thinking of thoughts themselves become ourselves.
Yeah, it's like we're talking to the puppet and not realizing it's our hand
Yes,
up the sleeve there, working the
excellent,
mouse.
excellent metaphor. It's like talking to a mirror and expecting the mirror to respond.
Yeah. Or the mirror is responding, and then you're like your your hands up that took us for moving the mouth. It's like,
Well, and in a sense, yeah, in that in your description, yes, because now you're the puppet master giving the impression. But if you're actually talking to a mirror and it's responding, now you're really hallucinating and really in a trance, because that thing in the mirror may be a reflection of us, but that reflection has nothing beneath the surface of that image.
yeah.
So it has no ears, it has no eyes, it has no vision, it has no audio. If I'm talking to myself and it has no audio, I can talk forever and never have it hear anything I say, which seems to be very consistent with the experience. I keep thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking about how to fix this thing, and the more thinking I do about it gives it more credit for actually existing, as though it's really there, when in fact it's just a thought about a thought itself. And the idea that it's myself and who I am rather than simply what I'm thinking causes great grief, because there seems to be nothing I can do about it the more I do. So here's what's also interesting. The steps effectively are asking us two things: to begin to be honest with ourselves. And if we're mistaking that for something that's dishonest, there's an impossibility right there. But it's also asking us to serve others, to take action in favor of others. Well, if the self I think I am is other than the self I am, I think that self is another. Literally, I've given it the same classification of all the other people in the world. I don't see it as myself, I see it as another self. Since if I am the one talking to myself, I know that I'm talking, and I'm talking to something that can't respond. So I keep talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and wonder why I can't get any kind of good response out of it. And I would say, given that we have made believe that we're the creator of reality by believing that becomes ourself, we're actually talking to what we think is God, because we're the creator of reality, and wondering why God never responds.
Or responds poorly.
Yes, occasionally we seem to get it right enough to say, well, things are a little better than horrible, and that feels better, so I'm willing to live with that. Or come up with rituals where we're constantly trying to feel better and actually feel better and think that that's solved the problem, when in fact we're doing exactly what we did when we were intoxicated with alcohol, and thinking that the intoxication consumed our preoccupation made us feel better, when in fact the thing we were doing that was wrong to cause the idea that we needed to get better continued and grew. So the other centeredness becomes self-centered, and it becomes just a new impossibility. And I worked with enough people, and I know that people within sobriety struggle with this. And it's a legitimate struggle to the degree that we struggle with it. It isn't legitimate. It's like an illegitimate child is still a child that's actually very legitimate. The fact that it doesn't abide by the laws and dictates of human does not undermine its natural essence. So the fact that we're doing it, and it's sort of like creating a nightmare all the time and thinking we're not the creators of it. When in fact, if we didn't sleep and we didn't rest and didn't have a brain and didn't have a body, we'd never have a nightmare. We wouldn't have anything.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little bit sleepy, having
Me
trouble
too.
sleeping, but last night at least. But I had another dream and I couldn't remember it. I was gonna write it down, but it was just a crazy dream again last night.
Mhm.
So
Do you not normally see those or
no,
remember them?
No, I'm not a heavy dreamer at
So
night.
you're probably actually sleeping better because those dreams tend to come in REM sleep, which is the deep sleep.
Hmm.
So what's interesting in this whole process, speaking of this in terms of practicality, since everything has been backward, we still tend to think with this presumption of everything being backward. So the thing that's actually healing and getting better, we see as something that's a problem. And part of that we discussed yesterday, and I don't think I elaborated enough, but to begin seeing this clearly is to begin to actually witness the disturbance that we've been living with and thinking wasn't there because we've been desensitizing our ability to feel it and thinking that that made us better.
Hmm.
So the bad news is that feeling worse in this is actually getting better because we're starting to feel things accurately. We're not resisting them. And as a result, they will no longer persist because they begin to dissolve because there's nothing there to maintain them. It's only a resistance to a thought that we're keeping these things seemingly afloat. Those conditions, the
Yeah.
disturbances, the anxiety, the stress, and all that. As it begins to leave, I thought at first I was hyperventilating, and I realized that the constriction of my vascular system was actually opening up, and I needed more air because I hadn't been breathing very well. You know, we're the only species that has breathwork classes. So if we're tightening up through tension, we're also inflaming our interior's ability to function. Organs disintegrate, and everything under pressure in our body does not work well when it's stressed.
Yeah, that's been lately. I've had this knot in my back for like a couple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Just work's been insane, 10, 12-hour days, day after day. Not taking care of myself, body self. Um,
Well, and
so
there's a possibility that's been there a while and you haven't noticed. What I have found about tension, especially, is I think I've talked about my neck in the last since we started doing this together and more publicly. I'd gotten to the point where my neck was so stiff I could barely turn it, and it slowly released. But when it releases, these cracks that sound, I'm sure everybody can hear them 10 feet away because they sound in my head like they are little firecrackers. Whenever that release occurs, the underlying pain becomes more obvious.
hmm,
And I started to realize within numbness is actually the absence of pain or the attempt to desensitize pain. And that's what the body does. Tension actually it doesn't know what to do with the pain, so it just goes numb. Sort of like the instinctual response to fear. If we're really hurt, the body starts to generate all kinds of chemicals to protect us against the overwhelming pain. It's still there, but we're actually being given adrenaline and all kinds of other stuff to overcome it,
mhm.
or to at least not completely fall apart in the face of it. So it's like we have our own anesthesiologist working on our behalf. And yet we abuse it to the degree that we undermine our body's ability to function based on the idea that we can manage the stress while maintaining the stress and think that that's a winning combination.
Yeah. Or that desire to like have to, I don't know if it goes back to people pleasing, but like have to work, have to do this, have to get that email out, have to.
Well, think about having to have something and how redundant that is. And the basic mental obsession is thinking we have to do something to fix something, when it's the thinking we have to do anything that is contemptful because it's based on a demand rather than a simple want and a desire. So if I want something, I cannot want it. If I think I have to do it, I think that I am really falling down by not doing that thing. So I seem to be constantly driven by this slave master to work, which isn't very fun. It's very demeaning, actually, because it's uninspired. And the problems that you talk about often being your business is building and designing, is the problems are huge given the complexities and the sensitivity to those complexities in relation to all of the other complexities. One small little, I think we talked yesterday about the bridges and the idea in engineering that it's the weakest point, one point in a bridge. It could all be built perfectly, but the one point where that weakness is where the structural collapses, the catastrophic collapses occur.
Yeah, the boat took out one pylon in Baltimore, and like several hundred feet of bridge just fell into it.
Yeah. And that bridge may have been built right, but it shows that the structure, when it's not integrated, is very vulnerable. And I would say feeling vulnerability is actually feeling the weakness of that structure. So to think of vulnerability as something we don't want to feel would be to ignore the vulnerability of something that is bound to collapse the longer we ignore it, or at least a potential for it. So to feel doomed would be normal because we know if we're ignoring it, trying to go numb to it, trying to desensitize our awareness, we're in a cycle of making believe that ignoring it, which is the basis of ignorance, is in fact helping. When in fact we have a sense of doom created because we know better. We have a greater sense of awareness than our thinking.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that with me of waiting for the doom, building the doom, building the doom dam to
So
someday let it go.
my sense is, since denial is at the root of a lie and maintaining any lie is always done in the present, the doom we're considering and feeling is actually the present that we're witnessing. And we're thinking of it as something that's eventual, so we can once again pretend it isn't happening now. It's like a cacophony of denial in all respects, because we're basically assuming that the lie is true. And now every defensive, reactive thing we do is trying to save us from that lie, while we are not conceding the fact that the whole succession, sequential consequence that's occurring is actually the sum total of that thinking being maintained over moment to moment to moment to moment.
Yeah. Guilty as charged.
Yeah. Yeah. And guilt is an accurate response or feeling to what we're doing. We know we're doing it. And so feeling guilty isn't an emotion. It's actually feeling the indictment of our own awareness for what we're doing. We've not only been indicted, we've actually been convicted. And the sentence to a crime is generally punitive. And to live as though we're constantly being punished in that way is a good example of how that all lines up with the way social dynamics have been developed.
Ooh.
So the maturing and the growth is not in the denying and the shrinking, or the constricting, or the denial in the hope that someday it will be true and someday it'll get better and someday some miracle is going to come and save me from what I keep doing. It's really beginning to see that it's the sitting with where we are as things are happening, starting to actually mention them, talk about them, which, to the point earlier about the abstraction of, we can sit and think incredibly vast things. But if in all of that thinking, we're not witnessing and willing to notice what we're doing in the present, in terms of our actions in the present, because we're always in the present. If we're not willing to notice that that experience is sometimes trying to take us away from the uninspired ideas we're having in the present, rather than begin to concede them and see that the expression of those inspirations that we think of and dream of and fantasize are all certainly possible, but they're certainly not possible by maintaining ideas that are impossible to ever fulfill. The idea that a lie will be true someday. And We don't have to think about the individual lies to notice the disruption of lying to ourself. This is really, our conversation is not talking about what we've done to others, but what we're doing to the other self we think we are. And the whole concept of having another self is a damning prospect. Rather than see that self, if I am talking to myself, I am still I. Talking to a self as though it's distinct from me. That's a self-induced, self-imposed, as the book says, experience I'm creating. It isn't true, it isn't real, but it's certainly something I can do because I'm free to do that. The question is, when I see it honestly, why would I ever continue? Recovery from symptoms is a recovery of choice. And the idea that we didn't have a choice than to do what we were doing is a lie, because choice always allows not to be chosen as a principle. So you can see the unprincipled thinking leading to the doom, the gloom, the compulsive effects. And I would suggest that you and I probably have a few compulsions left that sort of identify those impulsive, obsessive thoughts, because they're all tied together. They're all part of the same structure, seeming structure. They're delusional, but the impact on our body's taking for granted that we're feeding it information that we want to be feeding it, so it acts accordingly. It doesn't have an opinion. It just takes on the stress as though it's the only thing it can do, because it's the only thing it's getting in terms of information.
So I was gonna switch topics, but let's put this on the side, is working with let's just call it working with others, living with others. But back to your point, I think for me, or at least what I saw in the rooms at the time, when you get to that choice and realize you were making bad choices, that's very shocking. That's very hard.
Yes.
I'm not talking like, 30, 90 days where you're just coming out of the haze, but when you're doing step 4 and you had a choice and you made the wrong choice, that is
Well,
very,
you made a choice that was
or a
wrong.
bad choice, or
Yeah.
whatever choice. There's no
Yeah.
right, wrong, whatever, but that
No,
is
there's right and
scary
wrong.
shit.
There is right and wrong. Right works, wrong doesn't. Period.
Yeah.
But you're in that assessment, Gabe. You're seeing the present state. We're always in the present. We're always free to choose. And to the degree that we're free to choose, we're responsible for the choices we make. So to think of things as happening to us rather than being caused by us is an example. It's literally a manifestation that's giving us perspective to seeing how we're trying to escape culpability for the thing we're creating now, always.
But what was I gonna say? Um, how I sent some math yesterday, and
Yeah,
if you try and explain that, and there was some other stuff I was going to send about geodesics, which is a whole other can of worms, but
tetrahydrons.
like you can't start with a 5-year-old talking about differential calculus. Like you have to go through 1+1. Do you feel
Mm-hmm.
that that's true in sobriety or this disease we're talking about, that there has to be a linear progression of steps and achievements and understanding? Or do you feel like day 4, a sober person can grasp all of this?
Well, my sense is that we've never ungrasped it, because it's a sense of knowing that we never lose. My sense is kids have a greater understanding of this than the adults do.
That's
And what's that?
that's true. Yes.
Yeah. So it doesn't mean that they have the faculties to explain it or to put words to it. And that tends to be what we struggle with, because you're talking about a couple of things. The mechanics of understanding life, like let's say mathematics, obviously that takes the order of mathematics has an order. And to approach that order in any other order than the order it's prescribed is to not solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
So if the order of the universe is such that reality is reality and it's the basis of our existence, and we think the basis of our existence is what we think about reality and what we think about truth and what we think about life and what we think about existence and what we think about God and all these other concepts, we are out of order in our thinking. And we naturally create a reactive feedback. A reaction to a reaction to a reaction is a chain reaction, giving us the impression the only thing we can do. Why? Because I keep doing the same thing, thinking it will get better, thinking it will change. And it's always changing, but it's changing on the basis of the same thing all the time. So the effects stay the same. Depressing, demoralizing. It's immoral to make believe that the order of life puts my thinking about it first and life second, when in fact it's ridiculous. Because if I think back long enough to the moment before I started thinking, that would have meant that there was no reality whatsoever, no life whatsoever, no truth whatsoever. And yet people seem to have existed before I did. So thinking is subsequent to life. Thinking is subsequent to, it's a product of rather than the producer of. When I think I'm the producer of a self that's actually real rather than imagined, thought to be real, I think I am now the creator of reality, which means I am simultaneously, because everything in this universe has an opposite to balance it, I'm simultaneously thinking there is no other reality. To feel that aloneness is to witness the impacts I can create in my own thinking and think then, because I don't want to admit I'm doing it, that it's life that's doing it to me. Life's complicated. Life's hard. God isn't listening. I'm disconnected. I'm alone. And what's interesting about that is that even being alone would suggest we could be together. But when you're dealing with delusion, there is no existence for it whatsoever, which is where the ultimate letting go absolutely can be seen as something absolutely possible, because all we're doing in the moment is continuing to imagine that this is truth and reality, and I need to think about it harder, unravel it, rather than see that there's nothing other than what I'm thinking about it that's maintaining it right now. If it's delusion, I'm absolutely capable of creating it. To think of it as reality is one way of me excusing it and showing how denial is made believe to be the most wise thing I can do when it's actually ignoring what's happening in the basis of ignorance. And you can see things today, this whole internet crash yesterday. When humans go to work and aren't paying attention, things are bound to happen. Boeing's been a good example of that with the aircraft. All of a sudden, wings or doors are falling off of planes. That didn't happen too commonly. But our attention has so many different directions to go. I don't see a lot of people at work that aren't constantly paying attention to their text and their phone.
Yeah.
Productivity isn't helped by distractions, because the attraction of the work actually is the attention given to that work. And if my attention is distracted all the time, I'm not going to be doing that work very well. And I'm going to think I'm doing it well, because the same thinking goes into the idea that it's all I can do. And all I can do is continue to think what I'm thinking. And this condition that I have has nothing to do with me. And I'm constantly prone to trying to overcome it. I'm literally making believe that nonsense, meaning desensitization, is my nature. So what am I going to act on? Nonsensical ideas. And what am I going to produce? Things that are damning and potentially fatal and certainly flawed in the product. Doesn't take a lot for one person to make a mistake thinking they did it right before the whole system fails, just like that bridge with the engineering. So we're witnessing that, doors coming off of a modern airplane. This isn't back when Orville and Wilbur were, they didn't have a door fly off their plane.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think they had
They
doors.
don't have doors.
But somehow they were hanging on. The wings didn't fall off. The wheels didn't fall off. And here, with all our advancement that's happening, and I would say the sum total of the stress that we're facing is starting to reach a point where people really don't know what to do with it. And I'm hearing more and more people say that, which to me is a very big opening to the potential of starting to look at things honestly and see that we actually are at the center of these problems. At least to the degree that we're at the center, it would be worth admitting that we're at the center. I can't blame all things on that, but I can blame all things done based on that, And to your point earlier, starting to see the disturbance is uncomfortable. But to think that it's when it's there and we're creating it as something to ignore, it's not going to get easier to face. And so we're almost bullied into this proposition that further denial and further not facing it, further wanting to dive into fun and have fun and celebrate. Think of all the partying going on in the world. I don't know what everybody's celebrating 24 hours a day. There seems to be a lot of things to actually say, you know what, we might want to wait on that and put a little more of those resources, those tens of billions of dollars going into cocaine use and all that kind of stuff, trying to distract our attention and feeling better, maybe in a different direction where we'd have something to celebrate in real terms in real time with actual people, rather than the imaginary hallucination of feeling better until you wake up the next morning and realize, I don't feel very good at all.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's
Well, start
well,
working right
that
here.
leads into what I wanted to ask when I mentioned the other people is we spoke briefly yesterday about working with others, not meaning alcoholic others, but people in everyday business, everyday life,
Right.
um, practicing these principles in all our affairs. Um, and even though I was sober for many years, still not practicing these principles in my business, home life, fatherhood, um, still being the crazy one. But um, I found some relief, or at least some beneficial feelings of lately in the business and at home, just practicing these principles, being honest, being forthright,
Right.
uh, making choices and hopefully the right ones. And it's been, it's something we don't talk about. I think a lot of it in AA about going to the rooms and just being cheerleaders, like you called them, and then leaving the room and cussing everyone out on the road and, and, not tipping because someone looked at you funny at a restaurant, or like, just leaving all these non-living, non-sober living ideas while you're living out in the world sober. So,
Right. Well, even within sobriety, I mean, thinking we're helping people when we're really just helping them to the idea that we're a big help isn't help.
yeah.
What helps is people understanding that the struggles they have are exactly the same that we have. They're no different whatsoever. The faces may be different, the places are different, and the times are different, seemingly. But in fact, the essence is exactly the same. And to miss that is to make believe that time and sobriety actually is the cure, when in fact it isn't. It's actually greater exposure to the subtleties of the problem, if it's being looked at honestly, in my experience, anyhow. So as time passes, I become aware of the specks of dust that used to seem completely irrelevant because I was dealing with 2,000-pound blocks of ice that hadn't melted. And as it did, a single speck of dust on one of those telescopes up in space destroys that whole Hubble thing. Had to have a rescue mission sent up there because they had one little something on the lens, or one little thing destroyed its whole ability.
Like 1/10,000th of an arc segment off.
Yeah.
They
Now,
focus it.
so if we're honest, and I just heard you say, I hope I'm making the right choices. If you're hoping, don't worry, you won't. Because my
It's
experience.
new, Jack. It's new. It's
No, I get it. I get it. I'm not chiding your experience. I'm just pointing out that I lived for so long thinking hope was a solution, but I realized I was hoping for hopeless things.
yeah.
Literally hoping that the lie would come true, some fantastic revelation would occur to finally make up for all the frailties and all the mistakes I'd made to get me in such a deep hole, to feel so alone, so unworthy, so completely disconnected, so completely incapable. I always had lots of hope, but the problem was I had hope in hopeless things. Undoing that, beginning to see that reality doesn't need hope at all. If I express things honestly, I don't have to be right to be valued and principled. and to begin to speak in those terms, which, I talked a little about my business. I was a bullshitter as a kid and made a lot of money, but I knew something was wrong and I hated what I did. And I eventually got out of it and started to work honestly. And one of the things that started to happen, which just literally out of the nature of wanting to do things right and well, was beginning to say, I really don't know how to answer your question, but I will do some research and get back to you. And it was a huge shift because I used to always try to give people the answer.
Yep.
Immediately, fix the problem, fix the problem. And what I was doing was giving them a false sense of security. So their neurosis was being increased and they kept asking more and more questions I had to do that with. Rather than say, wow, when I'm honest, in my experience, it's like when I witness people being honest, it actually gives me a chance to realize I'm perfectly capable of the same thing. There's a reassurance that comes out of it rather than this reactive assurance that is constantly triggered with the hyper lying, the facade, the everything's going to be, if everything's going to be okay, why isn't it okay? That's worth asking. And to tell people everything's going to be okay is to say simultaneously, it's not okay now, and I have no idea how to fix it, but good luck. And that's a pretty demoralizing thing to do when you claim to be helping someone. So my sense is, Gabe, that this thing today, when you said I'm trying to make the right choices, of course we'd always love to make the right choices, but part of the learning curve, rather than the vicious cycle of repeating the ideas that we have that aren't true and thinking the more we repeat them and think of them, that feedback loop is someday going to pay off, when the payoff is this sense of this broken promise that we keep hoping for and hoping for and hoping for and wishing for, and praying for and never seems to come. And yet any reliance, not surprisingly, on a source greater than ourself, think of that, second step, came to believe in a power greater than ourself. What are we doing? We're finally admitting there's more to us than our thinking. The self we've been thinking is just thought, limited thought, is who we are. When we simply surrender to the fact that there may be more, we start seeing the limits of the thought as the beginning of every opportunity rather than the end of anything. Why would that be if it weren't the nature of our nature that we've been given? We're just starting to think about it correctly. If the essence of an absolute nature is essential, it isn't an option and it isn't a negotiation, simply the state of our being, nature, and the state of knowing. And we don't even have to think we know it to know it. But beginning to admit to thinking we know it is exactly how mathematics work when you start to actually follow the natural order and start to realize that what used to be a problem is already solved. When you know the problem can be solved, it's a lot different than thinking the problem is impossible to solve. And that thinking is what gives us that sense of doom. We know we're up to something that has no value, and yet we're trying to live in the narrow passage of these thoughts that we're repeating, that keep imagining it will someday, never now when everything is happening, someday, somewhere, someplace with more or less of something else. And that never comes because the present is always here. What's that?
That it will solve itself. It'll.
Yes. And the fact is it has, because it doesn't have any basis at all. The solution is always immediately here. To begin to notice that self we talk about, we can make up all sorts of things about ourselves. And when we know they're made up, just like we're having a dream and we wake up and say, oh, that was a dream, boom, all the effects disappear. But if we think we're not sleeping while we're awake because we don't have the capacity to dream, begin to imagine that this dreamlike state we've created is a nightmare when it comes to this self we think is who we are. And the solution isn't pretending to feel better about it and try to get over it. It's beginning to say, wow, I am actually capable of manifesting effects that can seem so intoxicating and so consuming that I can imagine there's nothing else I can do. I can become completely drowned and wonder why I feel like I'm suffocating. And I would say panic attacks are a good example of that. Nobody that has a panic attack is breathing deeply just before it starts.
They're thinking deeply. That's for sure.
Well, imagine though
In my
something
case.
imagine thinking so deeply as to think it's not here, is to think that the possibility of all that's possible isn't here either. So what's interesting about truth and reality is that it's completely superficial because it's always readily available. It's always in reach because it can't go anywhere. It's not in time or space, so it doesn't have a dimensional component to it. And if we take our thinking to be reality, we take our thoughts about God to be real and think of God as somewhere else that we need to find him or her. And first of all, we think of it as a him, which means that he's got a gender, which is kind of curious, especially today with all the gender roles and people struggling over this stuff. We think of God as a man. We've always thought of it that way. It's interesting that we've humanized God and dispirited humans. But think about the concepts of God. It's always somewhere else, someplace we need to seek to find. Now, if it's absolute and infinite, it can't be lost, so there's nothing to find. It's always out of reach, so it's always impossible. It's always hopeless. It's always all of the dynamics that come out of the thought we have about ourselves that are now being used to blame God for doing these things. And I just can't get, God hasn't answered me. I don't know what God's will is. Like God's sitting around trying to make a decision. God doesn't think. If there is pure consciousness, it isn't a process because it's not in the limits of these concepts that our bodies are designed to calculate and help us to manage this experience we're having called life, this life form that we're witnessing life through. Our functional capacity is based on our functional literacy, and our literacy is based on how well we're reading the language that our body is producing. And to think of that language, like those feelings that are disturbed, as a foreign language is to act as though we don't know what it's saying. How convenient to think that, to continue to serve the ideas that we think are truth, when in fact truth need not be thought of by anyone, and it does not become untrue as a result. It stays true because it's infinite, it's absolute, it's unlimited, it's omnipotent and also omniscient and omnipotent. It's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and all power. If that's the case, and when I started actually reading the big book, I decided I was just going to take what it said and go with that and see how that worked, because I had lied and fought it for so many years that I just figured, you know what, they're talking about a surrender. I'm going to put up the white flag and just go with it. But in that process, Bill says more will be revealed. We know only a little. Things started to occur to me that I think he was searching for his whole life. He took LSD with Aldous Huxley to try to find the solution to this problem. He did niacin obsessively, thinking that that was the solution to this problem, that the physical ailments would solve the spiritual malady.
This is after sobriety?
No, he was in sobriety
Or
in the 50s. This was during the time he was writing the 12 and 12. Aldous Huxley was living in Beechwood Canyon, and they went out to the desert. Exactly what I did at 17, and I still love the desert. It's a great place to desert society. In a way, not anymore. I mean, it's now so crowded. They have humidity out there. They never had humidity until there were 800 golf courses. But this idea, again, getting back to this idea of self, is that if it's simply imagined, it's not something we can't do. It's something we absolutely can do. But to think of imagination as something that creates reality is to miss the fact that that functional reality, that actual life terms, like the algebra, those mechanics, to imagine that they don't exist and I can just think anything I want, it's going to all of a sudden manifest, is to refuse the learning curve of what's happening, as giving us guidance. Actually, it's our GPS system. And we have a Geiger counter built in. We know what radio reactivity is. We know it because we're conflicted. We feel emotional turmoil, mental anguish. Those things are all indications something we are choosing to think. And it isn't the wrong thinking. Interestingly, I thought for a long time that's what it was. It was wrong. No, the wrong is easy to find because if all things are possible and one is right, every other option is going to be wrong to some degree. Doesn't mean that we can't get by making them and make the most out of things per se, as we say. But if something is right, acting rightly would actually produce the result that is possible almost immediately, or at least on the shortest function of change, because it would be a direct route, because we would not be dysfunctional in that process. And to miss the guidance system of this discomfort and think of it as something we need to feel better than or get over is to miss the absolute nature of our body language, speaking to us clearly, and learn from that as we go. And pretty soon, it doesn't matter what you say, what you think, you'll know very quickly that you can adapt, that you're flexible, you can adjust immediately. And that's how we're designed to function, my estimation. That's a fully realized human. Self-actualization and self-realization is realizing what's actually happening. And the self it's referring to is the I that I refer to when I talk of I am talking to myself and thinking there's a self to talk to. The I is still intact in that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm really talking to are my thoughts. And thinking about are my thoughts. I'm not thinking about myself. I'm not talking to myself. I'm thinking about my thoughts. I'm thinking about my thoughts. That's the contemplative advantage we were given to think about our thinking. No other species, as far as I know, does that. So we've taken this incredible advantage that we've been given, whether it be evolutionary or God, however it happened, here we are. We've taken this advantage as an asset, which is imagination and the ability to consider that things not happening are actually possible. It's just a function of realizing how to perform accordingly, according to the order of life, according to life's terms. When Orville and Wilbur saw that birds flew, they had an idea that humans could fly too. They had some basis to give them the inspiration to continue to chip away and chip away and chip away and chip away, well before computers and aerodynamics, and their version of a wing is still what's used today. And how did they do it? Piece of balsa wood with a fan. They noticed when it went up and when it went down that they were having an effect, and they kept sanding it down and chipping away until they got a shape that worked. And then it worked. If we are thinking in right terms, we do not need to think anymore. If I don't do math for 5 years, I don't have to think about it for 5 years to know how to do it when I come back to it. Because it worked, I'm absolutely assured it will still work, because it's a part of this nature that we're all sharing, this life's terms. But if I think it's wrong, and I think my wrong is right, and that was the point, is it's not the wrong thinking I'm doing, it's thinking it's right that creates this obsession, this lie that we are allergic to, because our brains are designed to process reality, not garbage. And yet, to the degree that they're given garbage, we feel like garbage. We feel like shit, literally. That's telling us, that's our body language saying, I'm feeling the thinking I'm doing, and that's the effect. If that's the effect, that's the thought. If I can't see the thought like I can't see my eyeball, I can certainly notice my eyeball is still capable of seeing, even though I can't see it, even though I don't understand it. I don't have to understand it either for it to do what it does when I open my eyes. And this spiritual awakening is the beginning of opening a greater sense of knowing, our thinking to this greater sense of knowing that we've always known. We've always known the piece of it. That thinking and knowing isn't knowing circumstances and situations. That's what we're given to deal with here in this experience we're given. It's just an absolute peaceful knowing at the root of our existence that allows us to clearly see those specks of dust as something that's interfering with the clarity we have to express that loving, absolute nature. Why is it loving? Because it has never withheld itself from us whatsoever. We are the withholders by our choices. We are the contemptful thinkers. We're not condemned by anything beyond that. There's nothing that can affect my pain and pleasure zones greater than the thinking I'm doing, because they It happens in the exact same place, not 2 feet away from me, not 10 feet away from me, but immediately where that pain and pleasure is in my human experience.
That's what I was saying is like, I don't know if I could you grasp this in the early days of sobriety, or your contention would be day one, you can't?
Well, my sense is we've always known it. The suffering we've done is the idea that we don't. Again, we think that the thinking is so commanding that we think thinking more and more and more about what we don't know is actually helpful. So, what you're really describing, Gabe, is something that I've run into and actually cleared a couple of dinner tables over this.
It's defensiveness, it's denial. It's like,
Yeah. And to think we don't know more is to think, again, it reverts back to this idea that thinking about thinking is reality. And it manifests reality. When in fact, what it manifests is, you know from the discussions we've had that there's only so much energy in the universe, right?
mm-hmm.
So if we just consider for a moment that that's reality, it's sort of a natural aspect of reality, the energy and the matter. And matter is effectively frozen energy. It's a energy that has taken form, right? Like our bodies are forms of that energy. So if there's only so much energy, I can't produce more or less of it by thinking things. I can transform it into things that are either useful or unuseful, either beneficial or not beneficial. So what Wilbur and Orville did was to continue to hew away, chip away, like a sculpture being revealed. Like I think it was Rodin. One of the guys said, "I know it's in there. It was Da Vinci.
Yeah.
I know what's in there. I've just got to get to it." So if we've known it all along, it isn't that we didn't know it. It's that we literally thought our lack of willingness to admit we knew it was in fact true. And I had this conversation with somebody who I respect greatly recently. And he said, "I didn't know when I didn't know." I said, "Well, I would suggest you did." He said, "You're not listening to me." I said, "No, I'm hearing you clearly. I'm just challenging the ideas that you're speaking." My sense is alcohol was never a solution. It was always a problem because it was an expression of a symptom, a mental problem. It was a symptom of a mental problem that was disease. That means the symptom was disease too. It was never a solution. That's the whole problem. The reason it didn't work and the reason that all the destruction around us occurs to finally get our attention, my sense is that destruction is equal to my willingness to deny I have anything to do with what's happening. I have to create that pain as the touchstone of spiritual growth to finally concede I am the responsible party for it. It's exactly what the steps are designed to reveal to us. Our culpability, the lies we've been maintaining, and a new way of beginning to turn in the direction of thinking about it principally. You remember, were you here when Richard came and said that Blaise Pascal said that the most difficult thing for a man to do, and I'm sure he was talking about women, but in his day, everything was thought of as men. The most difficult thing a man can do is to sit still in a room alone.
Yeah, that gets me itchy.
Yeah, well, that's a great. I mean, think of an itch as something that you just have to scratch, and that's kind of what we're doing mentally is thinking we've got an itch and we just need to keep scratching it further to resolve it. When in fact, if you have poison oak, it spreads it. If you have a mosquito bite, it makes it bigger.
Yep, and
So
there's lots of mosquitoes in this room.
that's very good. But that impulsiveness, that uneasiness is a reflection of something that's diseased, uneasy in our thinking. It's being manifest in our thinking, not our reality, because reality is stable. The balance in the universe is always kept. I think we talked about that yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm feeling out of balance or unstable, it's not reality I'm struggling with. It's my thinking about reality, my thinking about truth. So how do we get better? You and I talking about it helps. beginning to talk to others in ways that are more honest about what we're experiencing. Open. I mean, I went to get coffee this morning, and the guy said, he, we were alone, and I said, how are things going? He said, more or less, it's okay. And I said, well, there really isn't any more or less. And he said, tell me about that. So I started talking, and he said, I just went to a funeral, and a guy said pretty much what you just said.
Wow.
That the essence of existence isn't dependent on the body, and this is the transformation. And this, and I said, yeah, it often takes us to die before we see. And in fact, the one thing that doesn't even die is the illusion we have that our self, this self we call this ego, has any life. And in fact, we've even named the ego, ironically, as being the I, the capital self, the capital S in self. It's the low S. We've given it that name. Again, reversing the order of things to give it legitimacy, to give it some form of rational structure. Nothing true relies on rationalization and justification. It just simply is as it is, period. Everything rationalized and justified as a result is a lie. It's something that doesn't have any other basis than our analytical capacity mentally to maintain the idea as though it's reality and true. And again, it isn't the wrong thinking. We can do all the wrong thinking we want and never be condemned by it whatsoever. And I would suggest that is actually always the case. It's what we're doing within our thinking that seems to create another reality that we think is so ever present, because we know the ever present nature of reality is ever present. Certainly, if we're the creators of reality, we would think there's nothing we can do about it because it's all there is and it can't change. It's exactly what obsessive thinking is, the maintenance of a lie. And what's interesting is a lie can't be maintained, has no possibility whatsoever, no hope, no faith is ever going to get it to work, ever. So what's its outcome? Destruction, mayhem, riotous calamity. All examples of a disconnect in thought, not from reality. We're not apart from anything. We're simply thinking thoughts that have no part whatsoever. They're not even a part. To think of them as a part is to think of them as having a place. They have no place because they're literally delusion being considered reality. Delusion by its nature is an illusion considered to be real. So it can seem like a lot to talk about because of the complexity that, in my experience, I've considered my life to be. But in the simplicity of noticing it and as something that doesn't change, it means it's the basis of everyone else's experience already. So we don't need to tell anyone anything for them to have that. But it may help mentioning that we thought our thinking was in fact that, while it wasn't, to help unravel the ideas. Once somebody sees something as right, when you get math, somebody says, oh, boom. You never have to go back to all the steps of wrong that it took to see that. Those are those aha moments. I would say moments of clarity are the clarity of seeing things accurately and honestly. And it doesn't have to be right, to be honest. I don't have to be right to be honest. The beauty of honesty is that I can be wrong and simply concede, this is the best thinking I got right now. I don't know if it's right or wrong. That remains to be seen because it will either be applicable or cause further conflict and stress. But it's easy to relieve the stress in our conversation by beginning to get accurate about what we're saying based on the idea that what we're saying isn't true or real. And our thoughts don't actually define us. Like we talk about giving our word as though thoughts define us and words define us. They don't. They define our thinking, something we're doing, not something we are. So we can't become our word. We can't give our word as evidence of it's an evidence of a promise, but the problem is within the concept of thinking insanely, the promise is a broken promise. So the chances of us ever living up, the reason we give our word is to convince people that we're reliable. And we wouldn't have to convince them if we in fact were. They would know that. They would be aware of that because their experience would be consistent. And I would say most of our experience is not very consistent in that regard because most Self-centered thinking is trying to get something at the expense of someone else, rather than for the benefit of someone else. A lot of suspicion.
No, these are inspiring discussions.
Well, being where we are always and noticing that in terms of application is starting to just, my experience was I just started to admit that I know, I'm aware. And very quickly, when you bring light to darkness, darkness never survives. So enlightenment is actually waking up to the brilliance of the light that would be the nature of a living source, because nothing on earth survives based on darkness. I mean, I imagine there are things within caves that don't see a lot of light, but they're still getting the electromagnetic energy from the universe. The light spectrum is very small compared to the whole electromagnetic energy. But to see the light is obviously not to see the shadows, the casting of doubt, the shadows of doubt that we cast that can be haunting, because we think of them as leading to darkness rather than that darkness is created by ignoring reality and making believe we can create it. That's a very dark thought. The absence of substance means no light, whatever. That's a scary place to be if you think when the lights go out, there's ghosts. And the ghost is the absence or threat of my own actions and making believe something that doesn't exist exists.
Yeah, Jack, sorry, I gotta step away for 30 seconds. I'll be right back. Keep talking.
So if I've created an environment to give me the sense that there's something haunting, and I'm the one haunting the something, and I begin to realize that I know, that's actually bringing light to that darkness. And brilliance, as we talk about, isn't an intellectual function in terms of something that's developed by humans alone, but it's actually wisdom being expressed in ways that are naturally intuitive, because we're relying on thinking based on reality and truth rather than thinking is the creator of reality and truth. All we're doing is creating effects within the context of reality and truth, which we can do. And we do. And we manifest those effects. Our feelings are manifestations of those effects. Our words, then, if you watch your words, that isn't a suggestion you center your thinking, but actually begin to watch your words, and you'll see that some of the things you say don't make sense in relation to what we're talking about. And that we have, as a society and culture, begun to develop language around ideas that aren't true and begun to say things accurately when, in fact, the connotation of those things is seen differently.
Back.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So some of the things I can think of, I have a whole list of them, but I don't have it in front of me, is we say I was scared to death. And yet we live to tell the story. We see something happen and say that's unbelievable, clearly indicating that belief has no real basis in anything other than thinking that something can't happen. And when it does, it becomes unbelievable. We've actually witnessed it happening and think of it as unbelievable. It sort of shows the weakness of the thinking we do in relation. So maybe I'll pull that list out and talk through some of the things at some point. But we were talking about it yesterday in relation to that line in the book about ourselves.
Yeah.
And it can seem ridiculous at points, but when you begin realizing that we've actually been talking to each other in these almost covert ways and saying things like, you know what I mean? 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 You know what? In one way, yes, I do know what I really mean, but I'm begging for people to agree with what I'm thinking and the meaning of the words I'm using, which, if they're insane, because I'm thinking thoughts about reality are insane, then I'm trying and begging for everyone else's acquiescence to go along with this saying to give me confirmation that I am in fact right. And culture is based on that concept. It begins to seem normal, and as a result, seem like we can't do anything about it when we're absolutely free every moment to do whatever we want. And to see that is to begin to say that I'm also absolutely responsible for the exact experience I'm having right now, and to sit with that, to begin to breathe with it, is to begin to witness the consequences, the effects, the sequential accumulation of tension from the denial, not in the past, but in the present. And it's worth noting that there can't be any greater stress or trauma than what we do now with what's happening, because that's where the impact is on our body. So if I'm thinking of the past as haunting me, or I'm thinking of the future as dooming me, I'm actually dooming and haunting my present, creating present traumatic stress. And most often, people talk about it as post-traumatic stress, meaning it's happened as a result of something that happened back then, when whatever that thing is absolutely a part of this moment to be considered at all. It's here. It's not there. It isn't in any other place. That same thing with the concept of God being somewhere else. It's always ever present, where we are, as we are, the essence of who we are. That doesn't mean we created ourselves. It means that we are part of whatever that essence is, whether it's creation, whether it's process, evolution, whatever it is. It may be both of all the things we've been arguing about. Maybe all of the things we've been arguing about combined, and other things we haven't even bothered to consider. So to think we need to understand it when the understanding is misunderstanding the whole concept of what thinking is, would be to misunderstanding everything there is about life and such, and wonder why we keep seeking, rather than knowing that there's nothing to find. That knowing we know begins to cement, because it isn't movable, even though concrete is constantly curing and changing. But it begins to secure the insecurity and make strong the vulnerability, because it isn't making it up. It's actually just recognizing the absolute natural state of our existence. Is always where we are. And it is also where everyone else is, and where everything else is. Animal, mineral, whatever, vegetation. It's all based on that same essence. Doesn't mean all those things have the same potential to act the way we do, or do the things we do, but none of those other things that aren't human are depressed over what they're doing either. So it sort of isolates our actions in our thinking to what we are doing about what's happening out there, not what is happening out there doing to us. The root of the word breathing is spirit. And since air is invisible and seems not to be there, and yet we use it constantly all the time and rely on it without much thinking, it's a very good metaphor for the concept of spirit being ever present. And again, spirit is just a word. We try to give meaning to things in words to define the references we're making. Doesn't mean spirit is spirit in the way that you think of when you think of spirit as something that is demonic or unbelievable or something that doesn't exist. It's simply referring to an essence that is essential. And it isn't seen, and yet it can be known. The seeing in human terms of things that can't be seen visibly is the understanding, and recognizing that even understanding and substance as words reflect a concept that there's something beneath our feet. Understanding, substance. Dispositions are simply positions we take. And when we think they're real, we end up with dispositions based on that seeming reality. And those dispositions are generally not thought of as anything other than either impressive or depressive, because they are actually they're creating a weight in our experience based on the pressure we're creating, from the resistance we're creating, to the idea we're creating of it being real, than simply a position we've taken.
Yeah.
Any position we take is simply a position we take. It can be untaken as quickly as it's taken. We're free to do it. We're free to undo it. To think of it as something that can't be undone, that it's just us, just who I am, when it's something we're doing, is to again see how we have translated the ideas of thought into reality by making believe it's who we are and there's nothing we can do. The things we can't do anything about, we don't think about too much. The trillions of chemical interactions that our body does on a daily basis, we don't think about very much, if at all, until it hurts somewhere. Then we might think about
Yeah, but
it.
I'm
And
one
yet,
for Sicilian, Jack. I have to take it to the grave. So like
well, you will.
that
You'll
one
you'll take your body to the grave.
that idea of like holding a grudge and
Yeah.
not sort of uh literally rectifying the situation 30 seconds after to move forward and just, either I'm sorry about that or I misunderstood that, sorry, or just like I'll take it through generational graves.
Well, you can see in that thinking, Gabe, how we think it's real and we think it's true and we think it's the only thing we can do. It's all that it is. The only things we ever hold against someone else are things that aren't any more than a wrong thought to be real.
Yeah,
Isn't it interesting
cool. Yeah,
that the thing they did stopped, isn't going on, and we're the ones continuing to maintain it?
not only maintain but flourish, like just
Yeah. But
grow it.
think of God's concepts of God. Within many thought processes, God is vengeful.
Yeah.
Can't be true. I don't think God even witnesses the experiences we have, nor does God care. Would God care? It's not about caring or not caring. If in essence is essential, it isn't debating what should be going on. What's happening is happening, and that's the beginning and end of it. There isn't anything more than that. And if we've been given everything and we chose not to think that way, it's what we're doing that is causing the sense of scarcity and the lack as a result of the actions we're taking that are based on scarce thought, meaning very little, if any, substance whatsoever. That would be a natural consequence of that kind of thinking. It's not God giving or taking if we've already gotten it all and we are abusing, which I would say is abnormally using what we have in ways that are unnatural and unhealthy and illogical and unreasonable. And yet, within that knowing nature, there is no reason, there is no logic, there is no thinking, there is no process because it's an absolute state of being, present state of being, all of ours, everything and everyone, everywhere, all the time, always present, always available. And the insanity of the thinking is clear when we start looking at human history and see that that has not been thought of that way at all, for the most part. Not saying everyone, but for the most part, cultures have been built on and fallen apart as a result of. Cultures huge, much bigger than any that exist today, have fallen apart through time over ideas thought to be true that weren't. They're eventually bound to fail because something hasn't. If I think everything's fine because things haven't gotten as bad as they can, and I continue to maintain the thought, they'll get there in time. That's the pain, is the touchstone of spiritual growth, because it seems that my will only seems to be overcome by intolerable pain. It's like in the MMA fighting, the guys, they're in a headlock, they're choking, they finally tap out.
Right.
We do not need to die to face our life. And the idea that the life we're facing is in fact life, when it's simply confronting the fact that the ideas we have about ourselves aren't true, is to begin to diminish and dissolve that issue so that the inner conflict is resolved and we can begin to actually start operating on the basis of our absolute present state of being that is intuitive naturally because it's the totality of knowledge. And as a result, we can start understanding how to do things in ways that would make absolute sense and be beneficial to all. If we were each doing anything on any given day that actually solved a problem that's seen as a problem that worked, every day, everyone would very quickly assimilate that workable knowledge, because it would be big news that all of a sudden something that had been thought to be impossible is now possible, and all it takes is noticing that 2 plus 2 is 4 rather than 1 plus 1 is 4.
We're
But
really,
if we're thinking on the basis of life terms, it includes the wrong we're doing is in that thinking, to begin to see that we have no obligation to continue thinking that way. None whatsoever.
yeah, it's actually it's probably the worst thing we can do is what we're doing, but
Oh yeah, well, it certainly isn't great. My sense is that there's a to notice this, to witness this, doesn't require a grateful list every day, because the gratefulness, the fullness of greatness, begins to get recognized, and we're very thankful. My experience is that I cried a lot at first because I realized how many moments I had missed, and I realized the grief in my system from having missed those moments with those people, and still I experienced that sum total of I have been operating at such a depreciated level that I've been discounting people and avoiding people and ignoring the fullness I have in the experience of them by thinking only of them as how I'm thinking of them. And during that time, I'm grieving and I'm ashamed for it. And I am guilty for it and feel those things because I am guilty and I am ashamed, knowing that there's more to what's happening than what I'm making out of it. So there's both a grieving process, which is tears typically, and also an awe process, which is just like, wow, I've always had it all. I simply haven't been thinking that. And now all of a sudden I have the chance to actually step into that role fully that I've always been in, but taking my thinking with it so my thinking can begin to actually express it intuitively. Because now, rather than thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking, I'm starting to realize that thinking is actually the expressor of reality. It's designed to allow me to express life and love and all of those natural, absolute states of existence. So certainly honesty would play a part, because there would be no reason not to, because of what's missing in all that? Nothing. I'm not ashamed of that. I may be ashamed of the things I've done, but I'm still thinking about them as something not here, rather than realizing that the bright light of the present, there are no shadows left except the ones I'm casting and the doubts I'm creating and the uncertainty I have. And to be doubtful and uncertain is to see that I'm having thoughts that I know to be doubtful and that I know to be doubtful and uncertain. There again, it confirms the knowing, confirms the absolute state of being.
yeah. No, I just feel like, yeah, like we're creating shadow puppets on the wall with the darkness.
Yeah.
We're just,
So in seeing it clearly, Gabe, and anyone out there listening, a couple of things. As far as I'm concerned, we're having this conversation with everyone listening, whenever you're listening. And if you're listening, there's a good chance that you're listening because you had some inclination to look for something to listen to that had to do with the mental obsession or depression or emotional sobriety or the spiritual malady. Those are all components of sobriety. And they're also components of life, because sobriety is about living. It's about, to begin with, living sanely in relation to a compulsion, meaning not recovering from the compulsion. But emotional sobriety is beginning to live sanely. Living sanely is not living lies as though they're reality. That's not sanity. That's actually the insanity, seemingly self-imposed, self-induced, as the book says. So if all I'm doing is inducing that experience, it's something I can uninduce by noticing it accurately and honestly. And all of a sudden it becomes very simple to see it's not something I have any obligation to continue to do. But along with that is to start to see the depth at which I've been doing this, that I didn't think I was doing it. And so that thinking that I didn't think I was thinking starts to become exposed also. It starts to, like the glacier rises as it melts, I start to see that iciness, that defensiveness, that reactiveness, that hardness, that desensitization start to become obvious in the midst of often subtle things compared to what it used to take to penetrate my experience to get to any of that, to concede any of that. But in thinking about you listening, there's a link now that you can text questions. My experience was it wasn't until I started talking about this openly, and it did not lead to people happy with what I was talking about all the time, because it confronted a lot of the reactiveness in their own experience that I'd been used to kind of slapping them on the back and saying, oh, yeah, 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 that's great. Glad to hear it. You're going to be fine. Rather than saying, you know what? If I've been struggling with this and this is the human struggle, it might be talking to some humans about this. Might be worth it, worthwhile. So if you have any insight, the actual action of talking about this, in my experience, actually begins to confirm and becomes an applicable, just like service, an applicable action based on principles that begins to confirm it and also confirms the clarity I have in recognizing the wrong that I see and start to see that wrong not as something someone else is doing, but something that I am only able to see as a result of something I am either continuing to do or am clearly aware that I'm capable of doing. I don't see it now as them, I see it as us, and I start to see them as someone that I can actually have some degree of compassion for, rather than think of them as just hopeless cases and talk about the world. What I've realized is we all seem to talk about what's wrong in the world with great clarity. And if it's the same thing we're doing, we're not noticing that it's the wrong we're doing about the thinking about the world, that we're perpetuating this idea that there's nothing we can do, rather than doing what we can with who we're with and realize that we are impacting the entire world because we are not separate, we are not divided. An indivisible source is absolutely indivisible, regardless of how it seems within this experience we're having in this seeming relative universe. There's plenty of absolute expressions of the absolute, even within the context of this relative seeming universe. Light speed is one of them. The fact that when everything is changing, the fact that everything's changing doesn't change is another one. Everything's happening now is happening. That's one. That's absolute. How it's happening is how it's happening now. How I think it's happening. That's something you can always count on. If you're looking forward, look forward to the fact that everything that will be happening whenever you get to that place you seem to be worried about. So you don't have to worry about it. You can know that. And that knowledge can stabilize the thinking. Well, the thinking is really trying to figure out, am I going to get what I want in the future the way I want it? Or is it going to somehow be elusive? And the chance to actually do that is to be honest now, and then everything becomes possible rather than the only possibility becomes the thing you think you want, which becomes a greater impossibility the further and longer we seem to go. Simple is simple, doesn't change. Can't be any simpler than that. This can seem incredibly impractical because the awareness of the complications we've been causing becomes obvious rather than giving you more and more and more self-help ideas to make this seem to make you seem oblivious to it and feel better and seem more disconnected as you go. The pendulum always swings backward when we're trying to get it to go one way and not realizing it's always going to go backward within this realm of possibility that we have. If we're pushing always to be good, we're going to immediately start to notice every slight variation of bad in that and think about it as something horrifying, because it breaks our ideas about reality when in fact there is no reality in those ideas at all, only our maintenance of them as we're experiencing those things. They're all self-induced in that regard, and the self that's inducing them is an idea that who we are is only what we think. Not true. It's just something we do. We can't be what we do. I don't become a pilot jumping off of a building. And if I'm a pilot, I'm doing something. And how do I learn? Like you were saying earlier, Gabe, in terms of sort of the functional application of getting there, the law and order of math to a child relative to something they, in those procedural systematic efforts, the process is important. In the human efforts, the process is important. Am I basing my first step on something absolutely true? Or am I basing it on something imagined, hoping someday it will become true? Very different functional effect at the other end.
You start by learning to fly an Airbus 380.
Exactly. To your other point too, I did ask when I was very young, and it was in its early inceptions, and Werner Erhard created this experience for people. And the adults took, I think we started at 5 or 6 o'clock on a Friday night and went till midnight or 1 or 2 Next day, we were in our seats at 8:30 in the morning till midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, back in our seats at 8 o'clock in the morning till midnight or 2. It started with a weekday night before that and a weekday closing after that, for people to get what he was getting to. And I'm not suggesting it was the right thing or any, it was just an experience that he was creating that was shifting awareness and consciousness and had a dramatic effect. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people did it. But when it came to the kids went from like 10 in the morning till 2 on Saturday, 10 in the morning till 2 on Sunday, and they got it immediately. And what was interesting was the kids got it so much better than the adults that used to, then he would call this the story, as we talk about in sobriety, that we develop stories around things. The kids would say to their parents, that's just a story. They're 9 and 10 years old because they got it. They weren't so imbued with all these things they thought defined them because they were fresher in their experience. They were much more impressionable. And I think Socrates at one point did something with kids where he was trying to show that kids understood math, because if you gave them a little bit of information, they would naturally take the next step. If you didn't try to teach them, they would naturally find it because they knew it. But clearly, if he was giving them bad information about math to begin with, it would confuse them. And in present terms, now, if we're thinking about garbage and shit as reality, we're going to be putting that into the computer system, which is not going to work well as a result. It's natural. Our mechanics, in terms of how we operate, are very predictable. And the prediction of thinking things that aren't true are true is depressing. It creates impressions that are depressing, and they become more and more and more so in time. It's an accumulation, trying to get our attention. If somebody doesn't listen, people tend to raise their voice. But if we're trying to make believe our language is a foreign language and we're listening to our body language as something to run from and escape as though it's a threat, we're actually acknowledging that the thinking we're doing is threatening. But rather than look at the feelings as something that's giving us a clue as to what we're doing, the feeling of bad, the feeling of wrong, the feeling of disconnect, the feeling of isolation, the feeling of loneliness, the feelingness of that fear, that gripping, anxious fear, the feelings are telling us what you're thinking is causing. I'm feeling what you're thinking, because the feelings and the thinking occur in the exact same place. So does the pain and pleasure. It's all in the brain. To see them as accurate is to start to say, oh, I'm treating that language as though it's foreign, when in fact it's domestic, which is why when people raise their voice trying to explain something to somebody that doesn't speak their language, the voice tone doesn't matter. They're not going to get it across.
Yeah.
Speaking louder doesn't help, and it doesn't tend to help with kids either. If they're not understanding, they're simply not understanding. It doesn't help with adults either, because it just creates a reactive. So I'm not here to tell anyone what to think, only that you're thinking what you're thinking right now, and it's having the effect that you're experiencing right now. So if you're interested in this conversation, you're welcome to join it on Sundays if you're interested in the conversation. And if you have questions, you're welcome. Now there's a text link. You're welcome to text those questions and we'll answer those questions and engage with you. That engagement is listening is participation, but actually coming in the other direction is actually cementing the interest and cementing your confirmation that this is something you want to learn, want to grow from, etc. Just begins to actually complete the cycle. So any participation you're willing to do, we're willing and happy to have. Thanks for your time today, Gabe.
Yep. Thanks, Jack, as always.
Love you, brother.
Love you. Talk soon.
Okay. Carry on.
Bye.